How's it going, folks? I'm Matthew, this is Lemora's Cards, and today I'm talking about 5 more cEDH decks that you're going to want to learn to understand the cEDH meta. Now, I took a look at 8 of the most popular decks that really go over and showcase a lot of what the format is and what it looks like, especially at a higher level. And today, we're going to be taking a look at decks that are like a little bit below that in representation, but these are decks that you're absolutely going to see if you play cEDH tournaments. You want to know how these work. You don't want to get caught not understanding them. That's what we're doing today. If you enjoyed this video, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know down below, what deck do you think I should talk about next? Maybe give me a little list of decks that you think would be worth covering. Thank you to all my patrons over on Patreon who get access to the patron Discord, deck advice videos, coaching, stuff like that over there. Check out the merch if you haven't. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and hop into it. Use the link in the description below to download Whatnot, and you'll get $15 to use to buy Magic singles, sealed product, get anything that you want, really. There's no limits. You just get $15 on the account for free just for signing up. Use the link in the description below. Give Whatnot a try. First up, we're going to talk about a deck that we've talked about a lot on this channel, but I haven't really done a breakdown on in a while, and that's Korvold Faker's King, which is not the highest performing deck at the moment. Fairly popular though, and it is a deck that I think people can misunderstand, so we're going to be talking about it. If you don't know what Korvold does, 4/4 dragon for 5, flying. When he enters or attacks, sack another permanent. When you sack a permanent, put a +1/+1 counter on Korvold and draw a card. The main synergy this card is known for is its very, very powerful synergy with Dockside Extortionist, where every time we crack a treasure, we draw a card, put a counter on Korvold, and we can really start looping through our deck. This is, however, a fast, Jund, very proactive, turbo ad nauseum Underworld Breach deck. You don't need to cast Korvold to win the game. A lot of times you won't cast Korvold to win the game. A lot of times, Dockside for 4, powering out whatever, your Breach win, your Necropotence, stuff like that we looked at in the previous video, that's going to be enough. So for creatures, we've got 4 of the better mana dorks. This isn't necessarily the de facto Korvold list. I know Eric, whose list is what we're looking at, is thinking about changing his list quite a bit going into the Top Deck Invitational, but this is what I got to look at, and I think it is still pretty representative of the core of the deck. Really the 3 rainbow dorks, and then Elves of Deep Shadows kind of in a flex slot where you might also see like a Delighted Halfling or sometimes a Orcish Lumberjack, things like that. Skirk Prospector lets us sacrifice a goblin to add a red, including itself. So for instance, if we have Skirk Prospector in play and Dockside, Skirk Prospector is mana positive because we sack the Dockside, make a red, sack the Prospector, make a red. Plus we're going to draw cards off Korvold if he's in play. And another big part of this deck is the Reanimator package, which we'll get to. Tinderwall, basically a green Rite of Flame, just helping us make mana. If you haven't checked out part 1, I'm going to recommend you check that one out, especially if you're newer and don't really understand the archetypes and some of the staples. That video is going to be very helpful for you figuring out a lot of the basics. Then you can come back here. Witherbloom Apprentice, this is part of a combo. It has Magecraft. When you cast or copy an instant or sorcery, each opponent loses 1 life, you gain 1 life. This card in combination with Chain of Smog, which has target player discard 2 and can repeat that process. You use Chain of Smog targeting yourself, discard 2, copy it again, Magecraft trigger from Witherbloom Apprentice, and then you can do this infinitely and make your opponents die. This has come in and out of the deck. It's been out for a while, but there's a new reason it is in there that we'll go over when we get to it. Dosen is a way to shut our opponents out. We've got the Spirit Guides to make mana. Mayhem Devil, 1 is just a pretty good synergy piece with some of our sacrifice stuff that we're doing. It can really take over our board state, but also we can use this to help loop our Dockside from the graveyard because we can crack 2 treasures, ping down our Dockside with it, and then use some kind of reanimation piece. One of the best ones that we have access to is Ruthless Technomancer. This is one of the foundational, newer kind of cards of the deck. When it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice another creature you control. If you do, create a number of treasure tokens equal to that creature's power. For instance, if you cast Ruthless Technomancer and your Korvold is an 8/8, Korvold will be sacrificed, you'll draw a card and make 8 treasures. And Korvold can get much bigger than 8. It can get to 12, 20. You will use a d20 to track Korvold if you play this deck. Then it has 2 in a black, sacrifice X artifacts, return target creature card with power X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. X can't be 0. With this ability, the main thing we're wanting to do is we can spend 2 in a black and sacrifice 1 artifact, like a treasure, and then return a creature card with power 1 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield. Dockside Extortionist has power 1 or less. Tricky part of Technomancer doesn't care about mana value, it cares about power. So we can spend 3 mana, like crack 3 treasures, sacrifice 1 other treasure, and that will be enough to bring back our Dockside. We have have Skirk Prospector in play, we don't need as many treasures because we're going to be able to sacrifice the Dockside to be able to spend for one of that mana for the 2 and a black. And then if Mayhem Devil's in play, we're going to, when we crack those treasures, ping down our Dockside, putting it into the graveyard, and then we have an extra ping lying around, we can start pinging our opponents. So if we have enough treasures from a Dockside count, we're able to ping everybody down to death with Mayhem Devil and Ruthless Technomancer. If we don't have Mayhem Devil in play, we can get Korvold into play, especially if we're netting mana, and then start drawing through most of our deck, and then we'll be able to put together one of our wins and getting rid of our Korvold. Got to make sure you don't draw your deck. So here it's going to be a little bit more stapley. Gamble, Imp Seal, some of the tutors we're used to seeing. Again, if you haven't watched the previous video, watch that. You'll get a better idea of some of the staples. And then we see like some of the green creature stuff that we saw in some of the previous decks, like Finale of Devastation. Eldritch Evolution is very nice. It turns any of our creatures into a Dockside Extortionist. Praetor's Grasp can help us get access to different wins. Culling Ritual is a big old way to make a ton of mana and reset the board. Usually Korvold is on at least Wheel of Fortune. Sometimes you'll see Wheel of Misfortune as well. It comes in and out. And then the things that stand out, the Chain of Smog, of course, that we mentioned for our combo. Reanimate, which is 1 mana, return target creature to the battlefield under your control. Very powerful with Dockside. And Unearth, which is arguably better in this deck than Reanimate because you don't lose the life. Choose target creature card in your graveyard that costs 3 or less. Put it into play and it has Cycling 2. Either one of these becomes 1 mana, put Dockside into play if it's in your graveyard. A lot of times, a very common, like good play pattern you're looking for is cast Dockside Extortionist, cast Korvold. Korvold enters the battlefield, sacrifice Dockside Extortionist, draw a card. Then for any of the treasures you have left over, you sacrifice them and draw cards. And then any reanimation piece you get to bring back the Dockside and start drawing more and more cards. It's not uncommon for the Unearth, Reanimate effects, once you have Korvold in play, to basically be like 1 mana, draw 5 cards, make 5 mana, which is absurd. It's the way that this deck really can overpower what some of the other decks are doing. Instance, curse him and his Japanese stuff. It's gonna make it harder to teach you guys. So we got some of the interaction we've seen. Autumn's Veil is here. I don't think we covered that one, but it's similar to Veil of Summer, a little bit worse. Stapley cards like Deflecting Swat. This is a Dark Ritual. Culling the Weak, ways to make mana and sacrifice things. So Crop Rotation is a pretty popular card right now. You can, for 1 green, sack a land, search, put a land into play. It's very popular right now because of its synergy with Necropotence, which has you get a whole bunch of cards in your hand at your end step, and Emergent Zone, which you can spend 1 and tap it, sacrifice it to play at instant speed till end of turn. If we Necropotence down like 30, we can Crop Rotation, get Emergent Zone into play, and then get our whole giant hand of cards, and we can play them at instant speed in our end step. We have Entomb, which is going to help us with our graveyard and reanimation synergies. Guttural Response is pretty hot, counter target blue instant. Nature's Claim is a card that they've been on kind of back and forth, but now has new kind of a need for it with Necro Dominance, the new Necropotence variant. We talked about it a little bit in Rock's High, but this deck is so graveyard centric, like we talked about, that we need some ability to get rid of our own Necro Dominance to potentially do some of our graveyard focused wins. And cards like Nature's Claim can really help that out. Plus, it can just get rid of Heuristic Study, things like that. And then the Ad Nauseum, of course, we're nosing, we love it. Artifacts, whole bunch of mana. Lion's Eye Diamond, because we are an Underworld Breach combo deck. Some cards that stand out here more are Vexing Bauble. Not sure if we got to cover this one, but 1 mana, when a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell, and you can sacrifice it and draw a card. With Korvold, you can sacrifice this, draw 2 cards, which is nice. You can also just play this spell, cast some of your things you don't want to get interacted with, like on, you don't want to get hit by a Force Will MBT. And then once some of that stuff's down and you've generated some resources by like cracking treasures and drawing cards through Korvold, then you could get rid of the bauble if it's affecting you. This also has a really nice synergy with Veil of Summer, where Veil of Summer prevents our spells from being countered. So if we have a Vexing Bauble in play, we can cast Veil of Summer and we can play 0 mana spells all we want. Vexing Bauble cannot counter our spells due to Veil of Summer. Then we've got the Defense Grid, locking out our opponents as well. Grinding Station to help with those Underworld Breach wins. Enchantments, we talked about the 2 Necros, really just taking advantage of our life total, getting a bunch of cards, and how little we actually need to win the game. Korvold doesn't need a lot to just take an overwhelming position, especially if Dockside count is relatively high. Animate Dead, another way to reanimate things. Necromancy is a similar effect to Animate Dead. It works a little bit differently. The rules on both these cards are kind of nightmares, but Necromancy lets you play it at instant speed, which can be relevant. Underworld Breach, we're a Breach combo deck. We can loop through our deck with Breach, Grinding Station. We can use LED. We can, if we need to, we could Praetor's Grasp for somebody's Brain Freeze if we've already got a lot of Storm count. Mill basically our whole library, and then win with like Praetor's Grasping somebody else's Thassa's Oracle. something like that. And then Chthonian Nightmare is the newest option we've got for the purposes of reanimating Dockside Extortionist. Basically better than the banned card Recurring Nightmare. When it enters, you get 3 energy. So it's 1 in a black. When it enters, you get 3 energy. Pay X energy, sacrifice a creature, return it to its owner's hand. Return target creature with mana value X from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. For instance, Chthonian Nightmare, cast it for 2 mana. Sacrifice Dockside Extortionist. That goes to the graveyard. Reanimate Orcish Bowmasters. Bowmasters into play. Ping. Chthonian Nightmare's back in hand. Recast it. Bring back Dockside. Dockside count is 4. We can do this infinitely because we're only spending 4 mana for this loop. In the case of Orcish Bowmasters, it's also a self-contained win. But the other nice thing about this is we're sacrificing creatures the whole way. We don't even need to be netting mana or pinging people down with Bowmasters because we're going to draw our whole deck with Korvold. And in a pinch, it's just 2 mana, sack a mana dork, reanimate Dockside. And then currently he's on 26 lands. I know he's talking about going a little bit lower. Some of the lands we talked about, Emergent Zone, we're running basically every land that makes 2 mana. Ancient Tomb, City of Traders, none of the ones you have to sacrifice. Running every fetch land we can because they draw us cards with Korvold. We are very much a manual storm deck is how this deck really plays. But what I mean by manual storm is that a lot of times this deck will have the ability to present what might be a win, but it's not deterministic. I have a Korvold, I have Dockside count of 4. I'm going to crack those treasures and I'm going to see what I get. A lot of times you want to take it kind of patiently and really optimize your sequencing, where I crack 1 treasure for a black, Korvold trigger, draw, see what happens, see if it changes anything I want to do, how I want to crack my treasure, if I want to top deck tutor in response to my Korvold trigger. Lots of little things like that this deck will reward you for really getting the sequencing down. If you like reanimation, if you like casting Dockside and it being broken, if you like big, super powerful turns where it feels like nobody can do anything, and you don't like playing blue also, Korvold might be a deck for you. I think it is one of the most fun decks in any game, period. It is very difficult to play. It's not one I give to new people very often or recommend new people play, but it's super sick. Next up, we're looking at a deck on the probably exact opposite end of the spectrum, and that's Yuriko the Tiger Shadow. This deck is probably one you know if you know Commander. It is very similar to how it plays in Casual to an extent. Yuriko is Commander Ninjutsu, so you can pay a blue and a black, return a attacking creature to your hand, and then put Yuriko into play from the command zone or your hand. And when a ninja you control does combat damage to a player, reveal the top card of your library, put that in your hand. Each opponent loses life equal to the card's converted mana cost. The game for Yuriko, you're going to see lots of ninjas, lots of cheap evasive creatures, and just cheap creatures in general, because we want to sit one of these down and get the Yuriko value engine kind of rolling. We're running things like Ornithopter, Changeling Outcast, Fairy Seer, things that are very hard to block. Mockingbird, a nice new addition. It's just a 1/1 flyer that can also clone whatever. Synergistic ninjas like Thousand Face Shadow, Moon Circuit Hacker, Satoru the Infiltrator, and we're basically in a blue-black tempo kind of shell where we're trying to develop our board because we really take over a game that goes long with an overwhelming board presence. It's very hard to keep Yuriko down. You can't really prevent it from entering all that well. The Commander Ninjutsu gets around things like Drannith Magistrate, so it's kind of just coming into play if there's an attacker. It's just going to happen. And it will be kind of chill at first. You won't be too worried about it. But then as the triggers start happening, once they get 3-4 ninjas, you're drawing 3-4 cards a turn, and the life total pressure can be very high. You see we're running cards like Shadow of Mortality. If they flip this off of Yuriko, they're doing 15 damage to you. And you're doing this sort of tempo-y package of value-oriented creatures that are giving us stuff off of our attacks, plus our draws and our flips. And we're running that alongside very cheap interaction to be able to kind of tap out and develop, but also still interact. You can see that in the creature slot, even with a card like Subtlety. The game goes long enough, they're going to get you dead. They'll flip a 4, a 5, and eventually a 15, and then just boop, you're dead. Some sorceries. So we have Get Probe, kind of check if the coast is clear. Also a way to crack our top deck tutors. And this version of Yuriko is on Doomsday, which we'll talk about here. Top deck tutors are a lot better in this deck because we get to do the busted Yuriko thing, right? We can Scheming Symmetry and put a Temporal Trespass or that Shadow of Mortality on top and deal 15 damage to our opponents. Because we just have a way in the command zone to crack these tutors, we can also have one half of Thassa's Oracle combo, Scheming Symmetry, get the other half, attack with Yuriko. You're never getting the card off of your Scheming Symmetry you got. MDFCs like Agadeem's Awakening and Seagate Restoration, which we get to run mostly for free because this is not an ad nauseum deck. You're running massive, expensive spells, so you don't have to worry about the curve on some of these things in terms of how they impact ad nauseum, at least. And having lands that are actually good flips off of Yuriko is pretty nice. Nanogene Conversion is kind of a newish Doctor Who card where you can make every single creature on your board a Yuriko, which is pretty ridiculous. I've not got to see this in game, but I imagine it is stupid. And then Doomsday. Black, 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 pay half your life. Put your graveyard on top of your library and remove all but 5 cards from your library from the game, and you choose the order. So you pick a pile of 5 cards. That is your library. What Doomsday is known for is a Doomsday pile that you, once you're able to crack, you are able to just win the game. For instance, let's say I have a Doomsday pile and I have a Yuriko in play that's not summoning sick. So I'm able to attack with Yuriko, crack the pile, draw a card. Maybe that first card is Gitaxian Probe, which is free, draw a card. Maybe the next card is Street Wraith, free, draw a card. Maybe the next card is Gush, free, draw 2 cards. And you can see how you can kind of easily get through a pile where you've got rid of your whole deck and then you can kind of easily Thras' Oracle win. Doomsday is a very tricky, very skill intensive card in every format it's legal in. It is a brain bender for when the piles are a little awkward for you or you're trying to play around something, get interaction, whatever. But it can be a 1 card true win condition, especially when you have a commander that can crack the pile. Then we're going to have a bunch of interaction and ways to manipulate the top of our deck. Brainstorm. We got a 15 drop in our hand. Let's put it on top of our library. Tons of interaction, like I mentioned. Limdol's Vault, another top deck tutor. Lots of removal. You want cards like Dismember. Force of Despair is a nice new option, especially in the face of Nadu, which can be a board wipe that hits them without targeting anything. Flare of Denial. We got lots of kind of junky blue creatures lying around. And one of the few decks that even runs Flare of Malice. And again, you're seeing lots of free stuff. Mindbreak Trap, Rollick, Snuff Out, Contagion. That's like the Black Force of Will. Commandeer. Consign to Oblivion might look weird, but it is a 7 drop for the purposes of Yuriko. And it's just a 2-mana bounce spell. Interestingly, not on Cyclonic Rift in this deck. And then artifacts, not running a lot of them here. You know, we're not really tapping out for talismans. These cards that can help us get ahead on turn 1, power out some of our stuff, turn our card advantage into real board state presence. You have in the past seen Yurikos run things like Curse Totem or Null Rod to lock out opponents as in their artifact package. Not seeing that here. And then enchantments, we got Mystic Remora, Ristic Study. You guys know all about these. We're drawing cards. Then Blood Chief's Ascension, which for the purposes of this deck is basically just to keep life total pressure on your opponents. This turns off Underworld Breach. It makes wheels very deadly. Things go to the graveyard quite often in this format. And between the Yuriko damage and the Blood Chief damage, you're putting a lot of pressure. 22 lands, really 28 because this deck really likes the MDFCs like we mentioned. And it's a pretty standard Dimir kind of mana base. Yuriko, if you like attacking your opponents, kind of playing a bit of a control-y game, but also that plays to the board. And you just really like ninjas. It's still a pretty well-positioned deck. It kind of falls in and out of favor. Currently, actually, on a little bit of a streak, can do really well in the grindy, mid-rangey pods. If you get into those, you just got to make sure you don't die to the turbo decks. Welcome to TopDeck.gg, your community's home for everything competitive Magic has to offer. Whether you're hosting an event, playing for a huge prize, or trying to advertise your store to thousands of players, we've got you covered. Using intuitive pairing software, playing Magic is a breeze. All your players have to do is sign up online, then scan the QR code in store. Give your competitors the gift of perfect information as their bracket updates in real time. Then, when the match is decided, our self-reporting software saves you time and leaves paper match slips in the past. Leave the heavy lifting to us so your community can sit back, relax, and have a great day of playing Magic. Next, we're looking at Krark Sakashima. I really wish people would use normal commanders in their list so I could actually show what these things do. But Krark the Thumbless, 1 in a red, 2/2 goblin, wizard. When you cast an instant or sorcery, flip a coin. If you lose the flip, return that spell to its owner's hand. If you win the flip, copy that spell, and you may choose new targets for the copy. And it has partner, and it is partnered here with Sakashima of 1,000 Faces, which can enter as a copy of another creature you control, except it has Sakashima of 1,000 Faces' other abilities, which is the legend rule doesn't apply to permanents you control, meaning we can have any number of Krarks in play that we want. But why do we want to do this? That's because Krark in high flip numbers, for instance, if I cast a spell and I have a Harmonic Prodigy in play, if I have Krark Sakashima in play, that's 2 Krarks, which are both wizards, and Harmonic Prodigy doubles the triggers of those wizards. So I get 4 flips off of Krark for every instant or sorcery I cast. So let's take a look at a card like Gitaxian Probe. I can spend 2 life to draw a card, and when I do cast it, I have 4 Krark triggers. For each of those that are heads, I copy Gitaxian Probe. For each one that's tails, I return it to in my hand. Especially once you get a lot of Krark triggers, you start to be very favored to both copy a spell, potentially multiple times, and return it to your hand. So if I spend 2 life on Gitaxian Probe, I copy it twice, and then I return it to my hand. I spent 2 life, drew 2 cards, and I still have a Gitaxian Probe in my hand. Notably, if the card is returned, if any of these flips fail, the card goes back to your hand. The original won't resolve, but if they all succeed and you copy it, then the original will resolve. For instance, if I had 4 Krark triggers and they were all heads, I would draw 5 cards and Gitaxian Probe would just go to my graveyard. But we're really kind of playing for that board state where we get all these free or cheap spells. We'll just get to cast basically as much as we want. We can double our triggers up with Harmonic Prodigy, Veyron, if we clone our Krark, again, with like a Phyrexian Metamorph. So we're going to be casting and copying a whole bunch of spells. And let's just take a look at what we're dealing with here. Dockside, Simian Spirit Guy, we're making mana. Harmonic Prodigy, we kind of went over, but it also synergizes with any of our other wizards or shamans. Raw Monsu Mage is a new option. Makes your instants and sorceries 1 less. When you cast an instant or sorcery, flip a coin. If you lose the flip, Raw deals 1 damage to you. If you win, you exile him and return to the battlefield under your control, where he enters with additional loyalty counter for each instant and sorcery spell you've cast this turn. It's very easy for that to be a lot. And really what you want is to flip into Raw and be able to -8 him. So cast 6 instants or sorceries. Exile top 8 cards of your library. Can cast instant or sorceries from among them without paying their mana cost. He's also flipping coins. So he synergizes with cards like Tavern Scoundrel, which when we flip a coin, we make 2 treasure tokens. We can do a lot of that. We have Burgu. When we're casting spells, we add red mana. Dualcaster Mage to combo off with. Tutor effects like Spellseeker and Imp-Recruiter. Veyron doubles our Krark triggers as well as any of our Magecraft triggers. Works with Archmage Emeritus, which is when you cast a copy an instant or sorcery, draw a card. Stormkill Artist, when you cast an instant or sorcery, make a treasure. Ashling, which has a whole lot of text for its Magecraft, but has you discard then draw, and then if it's the second time you do this, you deal 2 damage to each opponent. If it's the third time, you add 4 red. You just won't be able to get that other clause unless you like flicker it with a Displacer Kitten, which you'll probably be able to do. It's pretty busted. So you can already see just in our creatures, we have a lot of ability to build a pretty daunting board state where everything we cast is just going to get copied like 3 times and then bounce to hand and we'll do it again. Sorceries, the Get Probe we talked about. Gamble is a tutor. Again, if we can copy it, it's pretty great. Overmaster makes our next instant or sorcery uncounterable as well as drawing a card. Rite of Flame for mana. We've got the Molten Duplication, Twin Flame, and Heat Shimmer, all which combo with our Dualcaster Mage as well as potentially making clones of Krark or a Dockside Extortionist. Step through can find us a wizard, and then Jessica's Will is busted. A lot of times you cast this spell, if you win the Krark flip on it, you make like 10 to 14 red mana and get 6 cards. If you win one, lose one, you can keep casting Jessica's Will over and over with a Jessica's Will mana. It can pretty easily get through your whole deck if you have a bunch of Krarks. It is a very, very powerful spell in general in decks with cheap commanders, but especially if you can copy it or return it to hand and just keep casting it over and over, you can go bonkers. Instants, stapley cards like a lot of the free interaction. Flare of Duplication lines up here. We might have some Krarks lying around, or maybe even sacrifice like our Harmonic Prodigy or our Tavern Scoundrel if it makes sense, or the Imp-Recruiter. Gut Shots, free spell, deal a damage. You can take out a board state with this thing. Like I mentioned, lots of the stuff you're going to be used to seeing, right? Fierce Guardianship, Born Upon a Wind, the Red Blast, stuff we've gone over, Swan Song. So let's take a look at some of the Krark specific cards. Mog Salvage is free if an opponent controls an island and you have a mountain. It's just destroy target artifact. Potentially hit a bunch of artifacts if we're able to copy it, return it, whatever. Pyrokinesis is like the red Force of Will, where you remove it from your hand, deal 4 damage divided as you choose among any creatures. Active Volcano, destroy target blue permanent, return target island to its owner's hand. I have not seen this card much. I've only seen it in a couple decks, mainly in the Japanese stuff. That's hot. You gotta love that. We're just blowing up all the islands, destroying all the blue permanents. Brightstone Ritual. We're trying to make a bunch of these goblin wizards so we can make a whole lot of mana. Any sort of cheap instant or sorcery can just give us so much advantage. And this is another deck that can do a lot of the manual storming thing we talked about with Korvold, but it just works in a little bit of a different direction. Like sometimes your line will be to offer you can't refuse and then use the copies to hit your own spells and make more mana. Actually, even on the Stifle to help interact with problematic things like Ranger Captain VO, stuff like that. Impulse is really interesting because it doesn't really show up much, but it's 2 mana. Look at the top 4, put 1 into your hand. It's a lot of selection if you copy an Impulse once or twice, especially if you've got any Magecraft triggers where you're making mana along the way or drawing more cards. You get a ton of selection off of Impulse. Artifacts, nothing too wild here. A bunch of ways to make mana. Springleaf Drum, Relic of Legends work pretty well with our deck trying to copy a legend. Enchantments, pretty clean here. Mystic Remora, Underworld Breach, and Rhystic Study. And notably, we're not running the Underworld Breach combo. We're not running Brain Freeze and LED. You will see that pop up in Krark Sagashimas. It's just not here. If we need to lightning bolt people to death, we can do that. We can like start flickering our Ashling, dealing damage. But also we have lots of ways to do Dualcaster Twin Flame. You lose access to your Dualcaster, you bring it back with Breach. Breach just is going to line up incredibly well with this deck because basically we get access to the card whether it goes back to our hand or our graveyard, just a different step involved. And then we're on 26 lands, still on a Tainted Pact mana base because we might want to copy a Tainted Pact at some point. Similar in some ways to a deck like Korvold, but you also, in this deck, you're also in kind of in a way developing like a Yuriko where you want to develop out your Krark your Sakashima, maybe some of these other cards that are giving you advantage off of spell cast. And you need to survive in the early game. That's the other good part of this free interaction. I've got the Force, the Misstep, like things like Submerge and Mog Salvage even can really come up in helping you stay alive. Stifle as well. You want to survive through the interactive kind of phase of the game, and then you just get super advantaged when you get to the kind of late part of the game where everyone's drawn a bunch of cards, but your cards are just better. If you have a Pact of Negation in your hand, everything people cast Pact of Negation in response, get like 2 copies of Pact of Negation, return a Pact of Negation back to my hand. I'm just going to keep doing it. That Deflecting Spot, Fierce Guardianship, it makes it like almost impossible to interact with you in a meaningful way. Next up, a deck I've talked about a decent bit and even have a full video on that you can check out is Thras, which is becoming pretty popular and does have a lot of variance in the builds. This one's pretty different than the one that I most recently have played, but a lot of the core is still there. We've talked about the busted applications of Rograkh. Having a free creature as your commander makes things like Fierce Guardianship, Mox Amber, lots of little powerful cards already much better. And then Thrasios gives us an infinite mana outlet in the command zone. If we get access to infinite mana, we can draw our entire deck with Thrasios, put all of our lands into play, and get to our win cons, get everybody dead. This version is opting to run Minsc and Boo, which is a pretty good value engine that can also control the board pretty well. It has a lot of text, but you make hamsters, you shoot the hamsters at people, you draw a bunch of cards. So we're a pretty creature heavy deck. We're running some mana dorks, not too many because mana dork stocks are a little low in a Bowmaster's world. Cards like Ragavan, Dockside Extortionist, main part of our deck. A lot of our combos work around with this card. So this deck is really built to get a very early mana advantage due to Rograkh and Thrasios, along with our high creature count using cards like Gaia's Cradle, Relic of Legends, things like that to really bump up our mana production ahead of pretty much every other deck. And then win with some infinite mana combo. We have access to Dockside with cards like Baron, which we can use to infinitely balance Dockside. You might see Temur Sabertooth in that slot as well, or the new Frog. I don't remember its name. We also have access to Kinnan, which we talked about in the last video, which goes infinite with our Basalt Monolith to make infinite mana. And we even have access to using Dockside Extortionist or Cloud of Fairies, if there's a Gaia's Cradle in play, to win with Cloudstone Curio, which is one of the kind of unique strengths of this deck. If you have a Dockside and a Cloudstone Curio, between that and Rograkh, you're able to cast Dockside. You only need a Dockside count of 3 for this to work. Cast Dockside, make 3 treasures, return Rograkh to your hand, cast Rograkh, return Dockside to your hand, spin 2 treasures, repeat this process. You'll net 1 treasure each time. Dockside count of 3 to be your combo is crazy. There's not really anything that lean that does that, and it's enabled by just our commander in the command zone. Plus, the same deal can work with Cloud of Fairies with Gaia's Cradle, because we'll untap Cradle and a blue land, and then net mana with our Cloud of Fairies. And we are really a dedicated Cradle deck, so sometimes you'll just play Cloud of Fairies as a ritual. We have like a good utility package of creatures to find, to search up. We have lots of creature tutors, so like Gilded Drake can be very disruptive to our opponents. Any of our combo pieces, of course. Sometimes you'll be in spots where you tutor for a tutor. If I need to go get my Seedborn Muse, sometimes I'm going to Neoform a 2-drop into Imperial Recruiter to go get Seedborn Muse. This one really does have that sort of rewarding play pattern of like knowing everything that interacts with your deck will help you find lines that a lot of other people might miss. We can also combo off with Eternal Witness. With this Snap and Gaia's Cradle, we can also make infinite mana. And we can infinitely Eternal Witness to Lightning Bolt our opponents to death as one of our win cons. Trophy Mage is a big one. We have lots of artifacts at mana value 3 that are important. We'll get there. Flesh Duplicate over Fimage because it is a bit more stable and we don't mind the double blue pips in a 3-color deck like this. Elodomri is a new option. I have no experience with this card in this deck. You can cast creatures off the top of your library and look at the top card of your library, and then you can spin a green, tap it, and 2 untap creatures, and then put a creature from your hand or the top of your library straight into play. And we have some big options for that. We can spend 1 mana, put in Seedborn Muse, Teferi, Tali, or Hullbreaker Horror. Sowing Mica Spawn is a nice utility thing to, we have a pretty dedicated lands package and we're a Cradle deck, so that gets that. Kitten, we have lots of ETBs to flicker. If I'm going a little quick through this deck, again, I have a whole video on it you can check out. That'll be in the description. Teferi is an option I haven't seen recently too much of, but it makes it to where your opponents can only play at sorcery speed and everything, and your creatures have flash. Tali is a big old way to win with a bunch of mana, especially with Tali and Displacer Kitten. You get the top card of everybody's library, and anytime you're able to flicker it or clone it or do anything to get more Tali triggers, you can go off. This can be an outlet also to win the game. If you've gone infinite, you can infinitely flicker or bounce your Atali and recast it and get everybody's library and win with their win cons. And then Hullbreaker Horror is another way to net infinite mana, which we talked about in Kinnan. Sorceries, a bunch of creature tutors that we've talked about, and then Lorien Revealed, which is mainly here for our Earthcraft package because we kind of prioritize in some of the Thras builds having basic lands, and this is another way to get it. Instance, we're one of the decks that runs Flare of Denial because Thrasios is kind of worth sacrifice, and we got a decent amount of blue creatures. We're our Rograkh deck, so we got Flare of Duplication. We enable lots of our free stuff very early on with Roger, and then Interaction, some tutors. We're another crop rotation deck. Muddle the Mixture is a nice tutor that can go get our Dockside, and then artifacts. But we have like the Mox Amber, good with Roger and Thrasios. Springleaf Drum, we do have that Basalt Monolith to combo with Kinnan. We have the Cloudstone to combo with Dockside and with our Cloud of Fairies. Cursed Mirror is a 3-mana artifact that's a clone and very notably does not enter as an artifact. It enters as a copy of the creature. So for instance, if somebody else has a Dockside in play, you can Cursed Mirror their Dockside and Cloudstone Curio will still work because Cursed Mirror is not an artifact. It's a Dockside Extortionist. Relic of Legends is a very powerful card in this deck. A lot of times like a pretty good mana start is like getting 3 mana, play the Relic. You're guaranteed to have Relic tap down Roger. So tap for 2, put Thrasios into play, hold up a mana. It's a very strong big mana start. It actually leads to a lot of the big mana plays in this deck. You'll also see some Rog Thrases opt to run Expedition Map to help find Cradle or other utility lands, as well as Candelabra of Tawnos to help break the Gaia's Cradle mana. And then we're a pretty good The One Ring deck. We're running Seedborn Muse and Manamo to untap it. Enchantments, there's some interesting things here that I haven't ran. Mystic Ristic, you know the deal. Wild Growth is more acceleration. It's not a mana dork and also works well with our land untapping stuff, which is we also do with Earthcraft, which has you tap an untapped creature, untap target basic land. This can really pump out the mana. Roger is just tap, untap a land. Like every creature, your 1 and 2 mana creatures or whatever really start to net a lot of mana. And then especially if you have Wild Growth on that basic land, you start going wild. Training Grounds mainly here to make our Thrasios cheaper, making Thrasios a much better value engine. Power Balance is the opposite of Counterbalance, where it reveals the top card and then you can cast it whenever an opponent casts a spell. So if they cast a 2-drop and your top card's a 2-drop, you get to cast it for free. And then Survival of the Fittest lets us repeatedly tutor for creatures. And then here we're on 28 lands with a nice utility package of things like Emergent Zone, which we saw, Gaia's Cradle, Manamo to untap our legends like the One Ring, Shifting Woodland to copy some of our permanents that have gone to the graveyard. A very fun deck. Again, one of the most fun decks in the format. Can turbo out very quick wins while also having a serviceable value engine in the command zone. This deck has a lot of flexibility and customization that you can do. I think it's a really fun, cool option. It's a very rewarding deck to play. Currently, I'm on the Rog side train again, but this is still one of my favorite decks in the format. And a last one is getting to be pretty popular in a deck I mentioned, and I wanted to talk about it because it works kind of similar to some of the decks we talked about, but it doesn't overlap that much with like the main 8 decks I talked about last week, and that is Ob Nixilis. There is, again, a lot of different builds of Ob. You can go very stormy. You can go very all in on the synergies of Ob Nixilis, but Ob is a 4-mana 4/3 flying with trample. Whenever one or more opponents each lose exactly 1 life, put a +1/+1 counter on Ob Nixilis, exile the top card of your library until your next end step. You may play that card. If I play Ob Nixilis, something of mine triggers, for instance, like Firebrand Archer, deals 1 damage to each opponent. I will exile the top card of my library, just the one. I don't get 1 for each opponent. If it hits multiple opponents, I still only get 1 card. And then I get access to that card and buff the Ob. So we'll run lots of things that can trigger Ob, and you'll also find that Ob Nixilis just gets triggered pretty often. Fetch lands, Mana Confluence, City of Brass, Mana Vault. Lots of these things deal 1 damage to your opponents. If you catch somebody slipping and they start Orcish Bowmastering your opponents, or you get to do that too, those are separate individual procs of 1 damage that you're going to be doing. So a lot of those draw engines don't be looking too good when Ob Nixilis is in play, which gives you a ton of card advantage out of the command zone. Plus, he gets a +1/+1 counter each time. You get 4 Ob triggers, which isn't that crazy to get. You've got access to 4 cards and you're now swinging for 8 flying trample. You will put the pressure on people very quickly in their life totals and just in their ability to stop your win attempts. Walking Ballista, which we can use with Agatha's Soul Cauldron to combo off with Ob, because Ob will get the Ballista ability. We'll be able to remove a counter, ping an opponent, Ob will trigger, we exile a card, put a new counter on Ob. Ping, 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 ping. You don't see this in every build. They don't all run it. It's something you can do. Disciple of the Vault. When artifacts put into the graveyard. Ob trigger. Hope of Yuriko triggers Ob and is also a silence effect the turn you hit somebody with it if you want to sacrifice it. Cataract Parasite is one of the best Ob trigger enablers in the deck. For 1 black, when an opponent draws a card, if you control a red permanent, if you have Ob, you do, deal 1 damage to that player. Every single draw, including their draw step, you get an Ob trigger. People will be declining their Ristic triggers very quickly. Sort of generically good cards like Ragavan, Dockside, Bowmasters. We've talked about Mayhem Devil, Oppo, Bergie. Dathi Voidwalker, a card that was a staple and I don't think is a Ob staple necessarily, but can be really nice. And then we got the Ob trigger cards like Firebrand Archer, Reckless Fireweaver, Keswick Flame Breather. There's a new Ob triggerer that's a little bit better than a lot of these cards, which is the new Otter that you can 1 in a red to get a card that when you cast a non-creature triggers Ob. Plus you can spend an extra 2 to get a copy of that. So every single non-creature you cast triggers Ob twice, which is busted. And then Prosper, just kind of a value engine that whenever you cast a spell or play a land that you exile with Ob Nixilis, you get a treasure. Sorceries, you're going to see a lot of the Rakdos good stuff here. Your Gambles, your Tutors, Jessica's Will, Besiege the Mirror we talked about. We are doing the dual caster thing, so we're on Molten Duplication and Twin Flame. Toxic Deluge is actually not, I don't think, that common in Ob, because if you take a look at our pingers, they're really small. A lot of our best creatures are like 1 and 2. We really don't want to kill them, but sometimes we can get in a board state where we just have a big Ob and everyone else has a bunch of creatures, and Deluge is fantastic cleaning that up. Grape Shot, actually one of the best cards in the deck, because you're going to be casting spells, triggering Ob, casting more spells. You'll be casting a Mox Diamond with just letting it go to the graveyard just to get more triggers, and then Grape Shot for like 10. I get 10 cards. Wild and pretty hard to interact with too. Instance, a lot of the same deal. You will see Ob Nixilis choose to run rituals that a lot of other decks won't, just because they care so much about casting spells and raw triggers. Desperate Ritual and Pyretic Ritual are both 2 mana, add 3 mana. Not the best rate. They're at like the downside of Cabal Writ level, but you just want raw cards and you see a lot of cards. So Desperate Ritual and these kind of effects can just help you power out more stuff. We even see a second board wipe in Fire Covenant, which is usually what I expect to see. Obs usually also have to opt to play lots of removal to deal with Drannith Magistrate, which shuts down every single aspect of this deck. And the Sawnhalf can also combo with our dual caster and would maybe be another reason to run Bolt in this version of the list. And then again, cards you've seen in most of the decks that we've looked at. Artifacts, bunch of mana. We're a Breach deck. You're going to see some of that. Lightning Greaves I have not seen. That's actually kind of crazy. But this deck did win a tournament. Soul Cauldron, we talked about doing the Walking Ballista thing. Also could come up with like, I guess, Hope of Yuriko and Dathi Voidwalker, Goblin Engineer. Mainly is a package with the Walking Ballista though. So we got a bunch of ways to make a mana. Grinding Station for those breaches. Cloudstone Cura makes us infinite mana with Dockside Extortionist. And Unstable Amulet's pretty hot. 2 mana, get 2 energy. When you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, deal 1 damage to each opponent. That's an Ob ping, baby. And Bolus's Citadel, which is super, super hot. We got the Sensei's top. I have a Citadel in play. Tap my top, put it on top. Draw, spend a life, cast that top. So anytime you get something like a land that you can't cast with Bolus's Citadel, anything like that, you're just going to be able to keep going with the Sensei's Divining Top. Really nice Citadel deck because there aren't really the like kind of dead cards, or not much of them. Almost everything you're going to hit here is just something you can cast. You don't have to worry about having a Force of Will on top of your library. And then enchantments, we also have the Thony Nightmare, more of that Dockside looping. Power Balance, which we talked about. Underworld Breach, we're a good Breach combo deck. Running Necropotence, we want lots of that value. Notably, we're not on Ad Nauseam. A lot of the leaner, pure Storm Ob Nixilis decks are. And then we're on All Will Be One, which is pretty famous for comboing with Ob Nixilis. When one or more counters are put on a permanent you control, All Will Be One deals that much damage to target opponent, creature an opponent controls, or planeswalker an opponent controls. With Ob Nixilis, you do this and you get a single Ob trigger. You'll put a +1/+1 counter on Ob. You'll get a trigger to deal 1 damage to somebody, trigger on Ob, go infinite. And then we're on 27 lands here. I've seen as low as like 23, 24. Tainted Pack, Mana Base, nothing too wild with the utility stuff. Cards that can trigger Ob like Mount Doom, love to see it. Is on the Surveil land too. Ob Nixilis, in a way similar to like Korvold, where he's an engine that works off of your own game actions, but also can be like the Ristic, Mystic, Crom, whatever, where you're also an engine that feeds on opponent stuff, where you really get them not wanting to take game actions, which is a great place to be in like a Rakdos Storm deck. So let me know what you think of these decks and what I should cover next. If you're liking this kind of series that I'm doing, always love to hear your feedback and which of these decks you might want to try. Personally, Korvold, Rograkh, Thras, Ob, any of these decks are really fun. I'm not the biggest Yuriko fan in the world, but I know that a lot of people enjoy that deck. I just love jamming. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, go play cEDH. Have a good one, everybody.